It's a very great privilege to be here to talk to you about the Stirling Maxwell collection in the setting here in Pollok Park in the Burrell collection and with Pollok House just up the road there. And so for those of you who are not too familiar with Stirling Maxwell and his collecting and scholarly interests, I hope this will be a bit of a taster for you to become more acquainted with them when this becomes possible again. And for those who are already familiar with them, I hope I'll be able to provide some useful reminders as to why this collection is so special and so important. And I also noticed recently, apart from the 60th anniversary of the gift coming up next year, I think that is, 2028 will be the 150th anniversary of Sir William Stirling Maxwell's death. And that's an anniversary that I, at least, am trying to bear in mind as a focus for some of the Stirling Maxwell projects that I've probably been delaying for too long. So William Stirling, who became Sir William Stirling Maxwell, was the son of Archibald Stirling of Keir, near Dunblane, and Elizabeth Maxwell of Pollok. Now, much of the Stirling family wealth he inherited in 1847 had come from sugar plantation in Jamaica and compensation following abolition of slavery earlier in the century. Stirling Maxwell is remembered today primarily as a pioneer collector and scholar of Spanish art, though he had loads of other interests and lots of roles as well, particularly once he became established as an authority on Spanish art and became an MP for Perthshire. So as a public figure, we can see that he had a commitment to access to art through his roles as a trustee of major public museums in London, and to access to education, particularly higher education, through his elected roles in Scottish universities, and that included access for women. His title, Sir William Stirling Maxwell, came when he inherited the Maxwell baronetcy from his maternal uncle, Sir John Maxwell, in 1865. He never actually lived at Pollok himself, but he was close to his uncle and visited and invested in the estate once he inherited. So he had two sons, the elder John and the younger Archibald. And so the estates and the collections were divided between them. John inherited Pollok and became Sir John Stirling Maxwell when he came of age in the 1880s, and Archibald remained at Keir. And as we go along, I'll show a few of the works from Keir as well as context. They are almost all dispersed now, which makes the core that remains at Glasgow all the more important. It's worth noticing here in this slide the prominence of both libraries at Keir and Pollok houses, since book collecting and the relationship between word and image was a key theme in Sir William's collecting overall. At Keir, Sir William added the central bay to Keir House in the 1850s to house his two-storey library. And one of the two wings added to Pollok by Sir John in the early 20th century helped to accommodate the part of the library that he inherited from his father. Before we move on to look at some of the Spanish works in the collection, I should also just mention another important and very unusual area of Sir William's collecting, which again reinforces the theme of word and image. And that was the work of the remarkable English painter William Blake. In 1853, during the very busiest period of Sir William's art purchases, he bought 10 Blake paintings at the sale of Thomas Butts, who had been one of the artist's few supporters. 6 of these came to Pollok. 4 remained at Keir, along with examples of Blake's illustrated books. These were later sold, but fortunately some of them are now in the V&A in London. Of the paintings at Pollok, probably the most famous and outstanding are the Canterbury Pilgrims and Adam naming the beasts. The collection of Spanish art and the fact that it was formed by the author of the first scholarly history of the school, of course, makes it quite special. Annals of the Artists of Spain was published in 3 volumes in 1848. The publication followed on from 3 short visits he had made to Spain in the 1840s. Most of his collecting occurred after this and after he inherited from his father. Those 3 volumes were well illustrated for the time with engravings, like the one of Velázquez in the lower part of the slide here. But Stirling also prepared a limited edition experimental volume of Tolbotype or calotype photographic illustrations, which was certainly overambitious, considering that photography as a medium was only a few years old, invented in 1839. But this led the way for photography as an essential tool for the study of art. Stirling's thinking was certainly that Spanish art wasn't particularly well known in this country, and the number and quality of illustrations of it wasn't nearly as high as for Italian art. What the text and the photographic volumes also tell us was that he was already a collector of Goya, including some of Goya's etchings after Velázquez, such as the Philip IV on horseback that you can see on the right of the slide here. Goya had died in 1828, and there was little information about him available in English, so the entry on him in the annals was very significant, even if it is not entirely without some criticism of the artist's style and work. So not surprisingly, Stirling had a major interest in portraits of artists and how they presented themselves and their role and status. And indeed, artists in early modern Spain were often very focused on improving their status. Those who came to Spain from Italy or had connections in Italy were frequently leading the way in this. There's 2 examples here, one on the left from the now dispersed Keir collection, and the one on the right is from Pollok. In the portrait by El Greco, we can see the Italian sculptor Pompeo Leone literally constructing the image of King Philip II of Spain. This interdependence of artists and their royal patrons was a frequent topic of writers on art at the time too, like Vicente Carduccio, who came over to Spain from Italy as a youngster with his older brother Bartolome, who was also an artist. And this is stressed constantly in Carduccio's Dialogues on Painting, published in 1633. Both artists, as you can see, present themselves dressed as gentlemen in high-quality black garments. We can also notice the change in fashion from ruff to collar between the 16th to the 17th centuries. Carduccio has temporarily left his paintbrushes and palette aside to take up the pen to write his book, and in so doing is also claiming the more noble status and privileges accorded to writers in Spain. Stirling referred to Carduccio's book in his annals, and he owned 2 copies of it, one of which is in the Pollok House Library collection. And in fact, one of our students, Carter Lyon, recently completed her doctorate on this portrait, including, this portrait and the relationship with the dialogues, and including a technical examination of the portrait. And these two portraits, we studied these and the context of 16th century portraiture in Spain as part of our recent Unwrapping an Icon project in collaboration with Glasgow Museums and the Prado, or in association with the Prado. We tried to determine to what extent we could regard these two as truly a pair, even though they certainly seem to be intended as companion pieces. Sanchez Coello was principal court painter, and he therefore needed a large workshop to be able to carry out all the royal portraits required of him, including the many replicas or copies to be sent to different parts of the Habsburg Empire. Certainly the canvas used in each case is a close match, though there are some significant differences in quality and detail. Philip's face, for example, is extremely detailed and would have required some time for sittings with the king. Everything in his portrait fits very well and is beautifully painted. That includes how his head fits upon his body, which is amazingly difficult to do, given that you have a separate sitting with the sitter. Hands as well. Hands are quite often other people's hands. In this instance, it looks like they are his hands. And then there's what the sitter is wearing, in this case, this wonderful parade armour suit. So what the sitter is wearing can stay behind in the studio when the sitter is long gone. So you can see that fitting things together is not quite as easy as it might seem. So this, so the Queen Anne, well, we decided that she was good in parts and slightly awkward in others, including how her head fits, and one of the hands is not quite so well painted. The Philip portrait may have been intended as the first original version, which would then have provided the model for others, even though no others of this portrait seem to exist, apart from a drawing of the head and the neckpiece of the armour, which enables us to match it to this painting. Whereas with Anne, there's a whole series of portraits of her dressed in a black dress, though with variations in the standard attributes of gloves, handkerchiefs, and chairs. Why he's wearing this particular parade armour for what seems to be a portrait commemorating his third marriage in 1570 is not entirely clear, as it's a suit that was made specially for him by Desiderius Helmschmidt and Jörg Sigmann in Augsburg in 1550 to 1551. This wonderful suit of armour still exists and is in the Royal Armouries in Madrid. And so we went to visit it and got to hang out with Philip II, as it were, who is very small and slim. Anyway, so he was on his way to meet his father at Augsburg and at the Diet of Augsburg, where Philip was named successor to the Spanish throne or thrones, though obviously its Damascene decoration works very well as a parade armour in terms of catching the light and its ornamentation. They're a good match for the metal thread and jewelled decoration of Anne's dress. The technique of painting the dress decoration, though, is actually surprisingly broad and fluid compared with the precision of his suit. Coincidentally, there are two Anne of Austria portraits here in Glasgow, the other being at the Hunterian in Glasgow, and this, as you can perhaps guess, belongs to another very similar series in a white dress with variants. You can also perhaps see, even from a slide, that stylistically she differs somewhat from the Stirling Maxwell version. And actually, the same former student, Carter Lyon, also carried out a technical study of this portrait, and an article based on it will be published very soon indeed. Portraits of Don John of Austria, Philip's illegitimate half-brother, became a lifelong interest of Sir William's. In our project, we also made a study of the portrait on the left of the young Don Juan in crimson. It was attributed to Sanchez Coello when it was bought by Sir William at the sale of the French King Louis Philippe's Spanish gallery in 1853. And you can probably see why, because it uses the same format and vocabulary of the formal royal portraits by Sanchez Coello we've just been looking at. But it's recently been reattributed to another court artist, Jorge de la Rua, originally from Ghent and called Juris van der Straeten. I don't know if that's the right pronunciation, so please correct me. Or George of the Street. And both artists would also have learned from another Netherlandish artist, Antonis Moor, who had worked in various royal courts in Europe, including Portugal and Spain. So though it's similar, Rua's style is distinct from Sanchez Coello's, and also some of the materials he uses and the way he builds up the layers of his paintings. These are things we hope to present in more detail eventually in another article. Anyway, I thought I'd highlight here a little more about Sir William's fascination for Don John of Austria, who was one of two kind of action heroes, you might say. The other one was Don John's father, Emperor Charles V. In Don John's case, he was the hero of the Battle of Lepanto in 1571 against the Ottoman Turks. And in Charles V's case, he, of course, fought on many fronts throughout Europe and the Mediterranean against the Protestants in the north as well as the Ottomans in North Africa. In both cases, Stirling perhaps initially thought more in terms of their literary image, in forms like romantic ballads, but in time he moved more towards combining his own historical and archival scholarship on them with collecting and reproducing their visual imagery, like these two portraits at Pollok. The swashbuckling one in the middle always reminds me a bit of whoever it was it Raleigh or Drake in Blackadder? Anyway, so you can perhaps even see in the slide that it has nothing like the quality of the Rua original on the left. And the caption gives an idea, too, of just how many versions of some of these portraits were produced, as it's thought to be a copy after a lost portrait attributed to Sanchez Coello. The lost one in this instance would have been due to a fire at El Pardo, one of the royal palaces outside Madrid. So the glass plate negative of 1867 produced another copy, though a direct one of high quality, albeit in black and white, intended for Sir William's illustrated history of Don John and his times, which he never actually finished, but was published posthumously in 1883. And in fact, both Pollok painted portraits were reproduced in it, along with innumerable prints. So I've called this slide of the El Greco portrait of a gentleman at Pollok a late star, partly because it's from later in the artist's career, but also because it's probably only of late that its quality is being more widely recognised. Again, we included a study of it in our Unwrapping an Icon project, even though its dating is probably just into the 17th century and the reign of Philip III, rather than the 16th and Philip II. And, excuse me, our colleagues from the Prado came to see it, including Leticia Ruiz Gomez, who curated a major El Greco exhibition in Budapest in 2022 to 2023 and borrowed it for that exhibition. It's such an acutely but sympathetically observed face and beautifully framed by this large ruff, the size of which helps with the dating to 1600 to 1605. I'm also including the X-ray of the portrait on the left here. This is the most recent X-ray. It was also X-rayed first a number of years ago, so we have known for some time that there was something interesting lurking below the hand in the lower part. You can perhaps see a distinct dark horizontal line that indicates the seam of an addition to the canvas. This line is even visible to the naked eye on the painting itself in good light. So the added piece of canvas on which the hand is painted was part of another painting with a still life, in which we can distinguish the fluted base of a vase or a bowl on a table or some other surface, with flower petals lying at the right. The added canvas has a very different and larger weave to that of the rest of the painting, and as I hope you can see in this slide, the hand and cuff are tonally darker. The folds of the cuff are also quite different from those on the ruff. The evidence then points to the hand and the canvas addition being later, perhaps considerably so, and not an addition by El Greco or his studio due to a change in composition or a request by the sitter. In fact, portraits showing sitters to waist length without inclusion of hands were a standard format in El Greco's portraiture, particularly around this date, as you can see from the comparative example at the Prado. The signature in Greek letters above the collar and to the ruff and to the right of the ruff is also standard. I don't know that you can see, it's too dark. Anyway, that's what's there. And that's also there. So they're very similar, the partial signatures. Oops. Getting ahead of myself. So moving ahead to the mid-17th century in Seville, we've also had the opportunity to study two paintings by Murillo from Pollok. I've called this Murillo painting an early star, because it's an early work by the Seville artist, datable to the end of the 1640s to 1650. And because Murillo was one of the very few Spanish artists to achieve early international fame, beginning in his own lifetime and running through to the 19th century, before his star waned in favour of other artists, including Velázquez and El Greco. And this painting was also one of the earliest purchases by Stirling at auction, at the sale of John Brackenbury, who had been British consul at Cadiz. It shows the Virgin and Child with infant St. John and is also known as La Serrana, which might translate to something like the Highland Woman. It came from the convent of the Madre de Dios in Seville, where Murillo's own daughter became a nun. And this link between father and his daughter after she took orders was mentioned by Stirling and was obviously important to him. He would have been told this by Jose Maria Escacena, the artist and dealer who bought it from the convent and sold it to Brackenbury. And these brown rectangles to the right on the slide, they might not look that interesting to you at first sight, but they're an important indication of how much we can learn by looking at the backs of paintings. So the one on the top left, there's a chalk inscription which says May 26, 448, which is the date of the sale. The 4 might look a little bit like a 2, but anyway, that's the date of the sale, the Brackenbury sale in London. And then below it is a stamped label that says F. Leadham Liner. This refers to Leadham, they were the leading firm of picture liners in London at the time. Sorry, that's a bit alliterative, leading liners in London, but anyway. So picture lining is when the original canvas has become damaged, as it might have done over the centuries, perhaps especially at the sides and at the corners, where the canvas was stretched tight over the stretcher or strainer. But it was also a big fashion at the time. So it's when lots of old pictures were lined with a new canvas, which was stuck and ironed onto the back of the original one for renewed support. The other label has been handwritten, but the writing is now almost completely obliterated. It's in William Stirling's hand, and we can just about make out the name part, and the name is Brackenbury. So it's likely to have been Stirling's account of the picture and how he acquired it. And this was apparently one of the main, or if not the only way that he often documented his collection. But unfortunately, there isn't another written or printed account by him of his collection that has been found. And this is very unfortunate because most of these labels have disappeared over time through the movement of pictures. So we've also had the opportunity to carry out some technical analysis of this painting recently, or at least my colleague Dr Mark Richter at Glasgow University has, with other colleagues in Switzerland and Spain. And this has included taking a few microscopic paint samples from the painting. And I'm very grateful to him for sending through this for inclusion today, because he's travelling right now. So unfortunately he can't be here. Anyway, this is very much current and ongoing research, so we're very privileged to have access to this. This one is from the blue pigment of the Virgin's garment at the lower left. Now, taking paint samples is an invasive or a destructive procedure in that you're removing something permanently from an artwork. And so it has to be done very carefully by specialists following strict protocols. They're tiny samples, smaller than a pinhead, taken using a stereo microscope, usually from areas where damage to the paint surface has already occurred, or around the edges, which are normally covered by the frame. And a cross-section of a sample allows us to see how the paint surface has been built up from the ground and priming layers through to the actual paint layer or layers on the top and the varnish. And this one is taken here from the fold in the blue pigment, and also shows a little bit of the varnish on top, and it's taken from here. Should have put an arrow into that exactly. So number 5 is a bit of the varnish. Number 4 is the blue pigment itself, which is azurite, and that's probably the commonest blue used at the time, though Murillo did use several other blue pigments too. It's probably mixed with a little bit of lead white to lighten it here. And it also has a few specks of red lake pigment too. Then below that, there's a greyish priming layer, again with some lead white and specks of red lake, probably to warm the pigment a bit. And then at 1 and 2, we have 2 ground layers. The first at 1, we're incredibly excited about. Because we think this might be what's referred to in the literature of the time as Seville earth, or Tierra de Sevilla. And that reference is from the other great Spanish treatise on art, not by Carduccio, but by Velázquez's father-in-law, Francisco de Pacheco, who worked in Seville in the early 17th century. And by Tierra de Sevilla, he literally means earth from Seville, or, as we believe, from the actual riverbed of the Guadalquivir River in Seville. So that's the latest news, and it's more exciting than politics even. And we'll publish this as soon as we can. The other ground layer at 2 it's the same as 1, but probably has some yellow ochre mixed in it to lighten it a bit. So other things about this painting that we've been really interested in are the dress and textiles. And we're fortunate that this is another specialist area of study we have expertise in at the University of Glasgow. And so my colleague, Professor Leslie Miller, I've been able to draw on her knowledge on these matters. The centre one here is what really got me going on this a number of years ago. And that's because it was mentioned by Stirling, and his interpretation of it would again have come from Escathena. So this is the shawl in which the babe has been sat and wrapped on the Virgin's lap. And he referred to it as a Moorish cloth of the type that was still being produced in the Sierra de Niebla in the province of Huelva to the west of Seville. So very specific. And indeed, there are a number of popular shawls and textiles like this in museums in Huelva and Andalusia generally. And popular in the sense of the people and not expensive. Their term Moorish probably doesn't literally mean, or not specifically Moorish, but probably popular across both Andalusia and the north of Africa. And the inclusion of these kinds of items was common in Murillo's religious works. And you'll also see it in some of Zurbaran's works if you go to the current exhibition in London. The other textiles seem more expensive, like the goldish scarf so beautifully painted over the Virgin's shoulders. And then there is this extraordinary blue garment, which is clearly incredibly heavy, as we can see from the width of the folds. So it's likely to be lined rather than just edged with this brown fabric we can see, which may be fur, which would be expensive, though Leslie also suggests it might be a cheaper wool alternative called shag. Anyway, a heavy garment to keep the cold out, and maybe more a blanket than a skirt, as Leslie suggests. The other smaller Murillo at Pollok is this head of the Virgin, and it was bought, we think, at the sale in London in 1851 of another diplomat, General John Meade, who had been in Madrid. You can see from the comparative images that this is a study of the head of the Virgin in one of Murillo's many versions of the Immaculate Conception, the religious subject for which he became best known. And the complete work is huge. In fact, it's referred to in Spain as La Colosal. And you'll see it hanging high up in one of the galleries if you go to Seville Museum. But it was originally painted for the Franciscans in Seville as part of Murillo's first major religious commission in the late 1640s to 1650. The Pollok painting appears more delicate and more finished, so it was probably meant as a standalone separate work rather than just a study, and quite likely it dates from a little later. Just very quickly in passing, a couple of reminders of another two religious works at Pollok that might be familiar to you, by painters who worked in Seville, which we haven't yet had the chance to study in detail, but we'd like to. The first on the left is this very large canvas by Alonso Cano, who's another fascinating painter and sculptor and architect and designer. In fact, the frontispiece to Stirling's Annals was adapted from one of his altarpiece designs. He was originally from Granada, but also worked a lot in Seville and also in Madrid for a time. And he was a contemporary of Velázquez and Zurbarán, and a little bit older than Murillo, though Murillo clearly learned a lot from him. So the subject is the first labours of Adam and Eve after their expulsion from paradise, and it's one of just 2 compositions currently known from a series that formerly hung in the large and important Carthusian monastery on the outskirts of Seville. The other one is Christ and the Sumerian Woman at the Well, which is now in the Royal Academy in Madrid, the Real Academia de Bellas Artes de San Fernando. The reason a lot of these religious works came onto the art market in the 19th century is because of the dissolution of the monasteries in Spain, mainly around 1835, but it was happening in several waves from the beginning of the century. Because the religious orders were seen as holding too much wealth and power and influence, so their assets were taken by the government and should all have gone into the new provincial museums or other public institutions in Spain, but somehow a lot of them escaped and appeared on the international art market for the first time. So this one Stirling bought at the 1853 sale of an English collector, Frank Hall Standish, who lived in Seville for a time and who left his collection to the French King Louis Philippe. So it was sold along with the exiled king's main Spanish collection after he died. Cano really deserves to be the next big thing after Zurbarán. He was much better known to collectors in the 19th century than he is now in Britain. And this composition, and a number of others by Cano and other religious painters of the time, came from a print, in this case a composition by Bloemaert. And you might remember, if you've been to Pollok, that you would see the painting and the print hung alongside each other. And this, of course, is Sir William's copy of it, and he's interested because he's an art historian. So using prints wasn't just easier and quicker. It wasn't a lazy thing necessarily, or not just, than working up your own composition, because Counter-Reformation thinking was that it was better and safer than artists introducing too many deviations from accepted church teaching at a time when pictures were how most people learned about their religion. And then on the right, a very beautiful and vigorous painting of the repentant St. Jerome by a contemporary of Murillo's in Seville, Francisco de Herrera the Younger. He also went to Italy and then worked in Madrid. It's not exactly based on a composition by Ribera, who is well known for his painting and prints of this subject, but it incorporates all the familiar elements or attributes of the saint's repentance, including the skull, showing he's meditating on his own death, and of course the trumpet of the Last Judgment. And there's also the remains of a not very legible label on the back of this one, that appears to mention Escacena, who probably, again, advised Stirling on this purchase. And then just very briefly to show you 3 examples of important religious paintings that were sold from the Keir collection in the 20th century, including 2 by Zurbarán, which I thought I'd put in since he's very topical at the moment. On the left, an outstanding version of one of Zurbarán's frequent subjects, the Veil of Veronica, which plays to his strengths as a painter of textiles and textile folds, especially white ones. This is probably his most surreal trompe-l'oeil version of the subject, with this almost photographic treatment of Christ's face appearing on the cloth that the woman that became known as Veronica used to wipe Christ's face on the way to the cross, thus creating the true image or Veron icon. This one is now in Stockholm. And the central one is in the Meadows Museum in Dallas, which has the most amazing collection of Spanish paintings formed in the 20th century. And this is the mystic marriage of St. Catherine of Siena at the moment Christ places the ring on the saint's finger, and their mystic union is blessed by the Virgin. Again, wonderful drapery folds and clothes that you might even imagine could stand up on their own. And the sense of a frozen moment framed by this spiritual orange light. Then next to it is a very beautiful young woman, quite likely a portrait, but representing another St. Catherine, this time of Alexandria, hence the sword and the martyr's palm, the attributes referring to her death and its manner. This was bought as a Zurbaran by Stirling at the sale of the French General Soult in 1852. And he had notoriously stolen a lot of Spanish paintings during the Napoleonic invasion of Spain at the beginning of the 19th century, and he refused to give them back. And when it appeared on the art market again in the early 2000s, I and a lot of others thought this was by Cano, because of its similarity to another composition by him. But now it has been convincingly shown to be an early Murillo, documented as coming from the Church of St. Catherine in Seville. And rather wonderfully, it has now gone back to Seville, to the Fine Art Museum there. So finally, to the lady in the fur wrap, which you can see and probably already know, we have recently reattributed to Alonso Sanchez Coello. And when I say we, I mean the team that worked on the Unwrapping an Icon project on this painting and the comparative 16th century portraits in the collection that I've mentioned. So I mean our colleague Pippa Stevenson, who was until recently curator of European art in Glasgow Museums and now at the National Gallery in Edinburgh, Dr Mark Richter from the Kelvin Centre for Technical Art History at the University of Glasgow, and our wonderful colleagues at the Prado, notably Dr Leticia Ruiz, who's head of 16th century Spanish painting there, and the team of technical art historians there who carried out the main technical examination of the portrait back in 2014. So why did we reattribute it, and why do we think it's not El Greco, who's the artist to whom it was attributed when it was first publicly shown as part of the Louis Philippe Spanish Gallery during 1838 to 48. You can see all these are the first reproductions of the painting here on the left, which give an idea as to just how popular the painting immediately became. And you see, they all say it's by El Greco, and they all say it's of his daughter. Well, there's no basis for any of this. El Greco didn't have a daughter, though nobody had researched this until the turn of the 19th to 20th century. And I should point out, art history is really quite a recent discipline. And El Greco was very little known outside of Spain, whether in France or Britain in the 19th century. But this beautiful portrait was popular, much more popular than El Greco's later religious works, of which there were a number in the Louis Philippe collection. But their more exaggerated forms and acidic colours were just not to the taste of the time, even though they are now. So perhaps the attribution was because it came from a collection in Toledo, but we don't know exactly. Anyway, once the sitter could no longer be his daughter, the theory then changed to his mistress and the mother of their son, Jerónima de las Cuevas, again without evidence, but perhaps more credible. But stylistically, the doubts were mounting among scholars who suggested perhaps Tintoretto in Venice. That was suggested as early as the beginning of the 20th century. And that's understandable, but it's just not quite right. Anyway, because of the mounting doubts, the technical examination at the Prado and detailed comparison with other El Grecos there, especially the famous nobleman with his hand on his chest, which would be around the date of the El Greco lady, if it were by him. And so the comparisons of techniques and materials as well as style didn't show any credible evidence for the attribution. And we also did detailed comparisons with the portrait of a gentleman, her longtime companion in the library at Pollok. And again, there was no evidence for an El Greco attribution, though, of course, he is a little later. But his El Greco's materials and techniques do remain very consistent, even as his style changes. So, next up, a woman artist, Sofonisba Anguissola from Cremona in Italy, whose work is praised by Giorgio Vasari in his Lives of the Italian Artists. She came to Spain as a lady-in-waiting with Philip's second queen, Isabel de Valois, in 1559 and stayed until 1573. She was drawing mistress to the queen and her ladies at court, and later to the two infantas, Isabel Clara Eugenia and Catalina Michaela. But clearly she was also appointed because of her reputation as a portraitist, even though as a woman artist and lady-in-waiting, she couldn't officially have a studio or assistants. But in practice, it's clear that she worked closely with Sanchez Coello and would have exchanged ideas and materials with him, just like Jorge de la Rua, for example, would have done, except she was more dependent because of not having her own studio practice. And we can see from the portrait of Anne of Austria shown here that she did adapt her portraits to the dominant style and format. And the Prado did analysis of this and other portraits by her for comparison. And there are some similarities in materials, not surprisingly, but stylistically we didn't find a basis for an attribution to her. On the other hand, you can see how difficult attributions might become when we look at this portrait on the right of Don Carlos in a fur coat, which is now at the Spanish Gallery in Bishop Auckland. Oops. Sorry, just before I finish on that. So the original by Sofonisba of this is lost, but the prince ordered a number of copies of it, which, of course, Sofonisba herself couldn't carry out because of not having a studio, and therefore they were done by Alonso Sanchez Coello's studio. So, therefore, on to Sanchez Coello himself, who we can see here does have strong, or I hope you can see, has strong stylistic affinities with the lady, and also in terms, we found, affinities in materials and techniques. So the Prado did comparisons, for example, with this portrait on the left, which is an earlier one of Don Carlos at the Prado, wearing a very similar short cape or bohemio to the one we think the lady is wearing. And then there's the portrait of Infanta Catalina Michaela on the right, which must date from shortly before she left for Italy in 1585, after her marriage to the Duke of Savoy. The other debate here, which is still going on, is whether whether the sitter in the lady portrait could be Catalina Michaela herself, which many scholars have argued, or at least they note the strong facial similarities, which the rest of us do as well. The lady appears, though, a little older, and personally I think it's more a case of both of them representing a current ideal of female beauty at the Spanish court. So, to finish, we've also studied what the lady wears in some detail, because this combination of garments is really quite unusual. They're all of the time, but combining them is unique, really. So we spent time on this because what the sitter wears really defines the portrait. And we also found in the technical study that the artist also spent a lot of time deciding on this, and indeed changing aspects of both the veil and the fur wrap. So our colleague, Dr. Hilary Davidson, now in New York, she's over there on the top right, she did a reconstruction of the hair, the high hair, which is like built up with false hair, and the veil at a symposium held at the V&A back in 2018, hosted by Leslie. The hair and the height of the hairdo is also very important for dating the portrait, because they get higher. And before the 1570s to 80s, they're more kind of heart-shaped. Anyway, so the pioneering dress historian Carmen Bernice argued that the hair especially dated the portrait to the 1590s, which would make all of the attributions more tricky anyway. But we think that it dates the hairstyle and the portrait is quite acceptable in the 1580s. We also reconstructed the fur wrap thanks to Dr. Lynn Gardner, who's a pattern maker who studied historical fashion and has also worked in theatre costume. So we wanted to see if historical patterns for the Bohemio, which were published around this time, the Bohemio or type of short cape, could work credibly in this portrait, and to what extent it was likely to have been manipulated by the artist or indeed the sitter or maids, kind of in the same way that a lot of fashion photographs might be these days through pinning and all sorts of tricks. Again, we decided that both the veil and the wrap were credible as real garments rather than just inventions by the artist. Anyway, so I'll leave it there, and thank you all very much for your attention, and to everyone who helped on this project, who are a lot of people. So